4 лютого в університеті Торонто у Харт-Хаус пройшов збір фондів для канадсько-української фундації з участю доктора Тімоті Снайдера, Інституту Святого Володимира та групи Kosa Folk Arts.
Note the beautiful exhibit along the walls of Hart House as you walk towards the Great Hall. It is one of our Talking Walls exhibit. It is a showcase this year, which opened in November, that marks the 15th anniversary of Kosa, a Toronto-based collective of artists, cultural activists, and diaspora community members exploring, reclaiming, and celebrating Ukrainian and Slavic folk traditions.
It's an attempt to encapsulate what Kosa is about and what themes and impulses have guided our group from the beginning and what continues to be central. Namely, its relationship to the earth, the life cycles, and life as ceremony.
Доктор Тімоті Снайдер прочитав лекцію «Історія України як історія світу».
I'm going to be making a lot of connections between the history of Ukraine and culture. Ancient culture, classical culture, familiar culture, popular culture. No matter how enthusiastically they taught you in Saturday school that Ukraine was the center of everything, these are connections that even the good Canadian Ukrainians might not know or find obvious. I started by talking about the present war. The war of 2014, when it began, Ukrainians at that time were referring to sometimes Russia, sometimes occupied territories as Mordor. And then in 2022, in the full-scale invasion, there was this notion that the invaders were orcs, which is another reference to J.R.R. Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. The most picturesque moments of the story of the movie involve episodes which Tolkien drew directly from Heidrech's saga, a Viking saga which has fragments which draw from old Gothic stories of battles that took place in Ukraine in the 4th century. From that saga as well comes a riddling game in which a king is trading riddles with an incredibly wise person who eventually turns out to be the god Odin. He always asks the same last question, which is, what did Odin whisper into the ear of his son Balder at Balder's funeral? Which, of course, how do you know? You weren't there and he was whispering. The king realizes that it's Odin and he's angry that he's cheating and he pulls out his sword and he tries to kill Odin and Odin flies away in the shape of a hawk. That story, which comes from Ukraine, was transposed by Tolkien into the riddling match between Bilbo and Gollum in The Hobbit, in which Bilbo also asks an unfair question at the end, which is, what have I got in my pocket? How is Gollum supposed to know? Gollum gets angry and tries to kill Bilbo. This basic story, it comes straight from Gothic Ukraine, 1,500 years ago, into the most popular, it's the basis of the most popular fantasy story of our time. The Goths, the European people, who we know from the 1st century AD to the 8th century AD. The Goths who began at the Baltic Sea, who ruled what's now Ukraine for about 3 centuries, who were driven from Ukraine by the Huns, who end up killing a couple of Roman emperors, sacking Rome in 410, ruling the Western Roman Empire, founding medieval Spain. Those Goths, those are people who came from Ukraine, who were incredibly historically important. Insofar as you know anything about the set of Germanic stories, you should be remembering that those things have a connection to the territory of Ukraine. Interestingly, these stories come back to Ukraine, and they come back to Ukraine with the Vikings. When the Vikings, or the Rus, as I realize many of you are more comfortable calling them, when the Rus come to Kiev in the 10th century, they are literally bringing with them Germanic stories that started off in Ukraine in the first place. Vikings, the Rus, as they traveled from Scandinavia down towards Kiev, where they eventually landed after 3 centuries of trying to make up their minds, they're encountering all kinds of other people. They're encountering Turkic speakers, They're encountering Iranian speakers, they're encountering Jews, they're encountering all kinds of Christians. And these Germanic stories get mixed up and mixed around and become much, much more interesting. The German gods, before the Vikings get to them, are a pretty boring bunch. But after the Vikings make their journey to Rus, suddenly you have this Thor character with all kinds of charismatic attributes, who the Slavs call Perun. Suddenly Odin has all kinds of interesting character traits he didn't have before. Suddenly there's this thing called Valhalla, which you go to after you die, if you're worthy. Suddenly there's this business of Ragnarok, a dramatic clash at the end of time in which the gods fight. None of that can be found in ancient Germanic stuff. All of it has to do with the voyage of the Rus to Kiev. These figures of Thor and Odin, Loki, Hel, all of them, as they turn up in Marvel movies or in Marvel comics, are a result of precisely culture which is developed in Ukraine. The horrifying American hegemony over world culture has its origins in things that began in Ukraine. My second example is Achilles. So Achilles, after his death, is conveniently spirited off to Snake Island, where he is worshipped as a god for about 1,000 years. Olbia is a town in what's now Mykolaiv Oblast. It doesn't exist anymore, but for a long, long time it was a Greek city. And in this Greek city, the main deity was Achilles, who was worshipped as having been brought back to life by his mother, and who lived on what Ukrainians call Snake Island. And during that 1,000 years, he had various wives and girlfriends. But in particular, there's one set of women who were brought into the picture, the Amazons. The Amazons at one point try to storm Achilles' island. Achilles, during the Trojan War, in one of the accounts, has an encounter with Penthesilea, who's an Amazon, and they battle, and he kills her, and then he falls in love with her, which is the wrong order, guys. Pretty much every important Greek hero had an encounter like that. Hercules had an encounter with Hippolyta. Theseus ended up marrying an Amazon. Bellerophon had to fight a troop of Amazons. These Amazons weren't real, though, right? There couldn't have been these Amazons. I mean, that's obviously a fantasy, that there were these women who fought. That couldn't have happened. The Amazons are real. The reason why the Greeks portrayed the Amazons over and over again in their art and in their stories was because they had regular contact with mounted female warriors on horseback who used recursive bows. Those people were Scythians. As far as we can tell from the burial evidence in Ukraine, about 1 in 5 of the people who fought in combat for the Scythians were biological women. We've had remains that looked like this for about 100 years, but for the longest time, these remains were characterized as small warriors with unusual pelvic structure. There is a major figure in the comic book world who is an Amazon and who has a lasso and can tie you up and make you tell the truth. That's Wonder Woman from DC Comics. Wonder Woman is an Amazon princess. And the story of the Amazons is present in our culture for more than 2,000 years because it is historically grounded in actual war-fighting female archers in what's now Ukraine. It's funny, but it's also serious because we're talking about major parts of the actual popular culture of the world, which could not have existed without a Ukrainian element.
We know those stories, but at least until today, we haven't seen Ukraine in those stories.
In North America and in much of Western and Southern Europe, Northern Europe, we have a certain story about Mesopotamia and Greece and Rome, and then we jump over to something called the Renaissance, and then we have an Industrial Revolution and nation states. And that's a story that is very familiar to everyone, but it's structured in such a way, not just that we don't see Eastern Europe. When the notion of the Renaissance was structured, the Greeks and the Romans were remade as much more westerly creatures than in fact they were. There's a Dutch painting that I really like, which is hanging in Vienna. It portrays a group of naked women with a bunch of armor in front of them, and then there is a bunch of men. And this is a very mysterious painting for a very long time, like what on earth could be going on here? Like the men have their clothes on and the women don't, but there's a bunch of armor, so whose armor is it? And the answer is that it was the women's armor, and the subject of the play is a story in Herodotus about how the Amazons meet the Scythians. According to Herodotus, they met the men once a year, and they just left. The Herodotus story takes place in what is now Ukraine. But from a Renaissance point of view, if you're a Dutch painter, or even now if you're a viewer in Vienna at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, looking at this painting, you're thinking, in the best case, this is Greek. And if it's Greek, that means the furthest east we have to go is Athens. So the way we think about this in terms of geography just rules out the Black Sea and the steppe completely. The darker part of the anecdote is that there were so many people in Ukraine who might have written this story, but they were killed. A lot of the stuff that I'm saying, Ivan Franko said. In the Ukrainian national revival of the late 19th century, a lot of the Ukrainian national revival, so-called, involved people like Ivan Franko or Les Ukrainka, mobilizing extraordinary knowledge of the ancient world and presenting Ukraine not as this unbroken ethnic history of stereotype, but rather as an accumulation of interesting civilizational sediments. There would have been more Les Ukrainkas and Ivan Frankos had the Ukrainian 20th century gone differently than it did, right? If people hadn't been murdered in the 1930s, if there hadn't been a famine, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. A lot of the things that I've been talking about, the evidence of them is right on the front. Like you can't get to it now, or it's under Russian occupation, or the Russians have looted it. So the Scythian stuff, for example, the most famous material evidence of Scythian culture is the goldwork, which was done by Greek or Greek-ish artists, but reflected Scythian tastes and Scythian stories. A lot of that was held in the museum in Kherson, which was totally looted. Every single artifact was taken from that museum and is now dispersed all around Russia, which repeats something that happened in the Soviet Union and repeats something that happened in the Russian Empire.
В кінці вечора представник канадсько-української фундації озвучив зібрану суму.
We're an organization with 30 years history that coordinates and delivers humanitarian aid from Canadians to Ukraine. Through this event, I'm grateful that we managed to raise together $13,000.
We are holding another fundraiser at the end of the month, and we also have, on the anniversary of the full-scale invasion, we'll be holding a grief ritual and singing, so we welcome people to that. It'll be here on the 24th.
Повну версію лекції доктора Тімоті Снайдера «Історія України як історія світу» дивіться на веб-сайті та фейсбук-сторінці Форум ТІВІ.